Hello.
Namaskar, Ingole sir. Greetings of the day.
Hello, good morning, sir. Hello.
Dr. Ingole, if you hear me, if you are able to hear me, greetings of the International Day for Biological Diversity.
Hello, sir. Hello. Can you hear me? Hello. Hello. Sir Manoj. Hello.
कर सर को म्यूट नहीं किया ना.
Sir, can you hear me?
Hello, we can hear you. Shruti, we can hear you.
Okay, madam. Thank you.
Sir, namaskar. तुम्ही म्यूट आहात. म्यूट आहात सर, तुम्ही म्यूट आहात. I think you are muted. You are muted, Dr. Ingole. I think you have to unmute yourself. Yes, I think now you are. Anyway, sir, namaskar. आता बहुतेक ऐकू येते. I think you're audible. No, you still muted.
We'll start in another 5 minutes. A very good morning to all who have joined us for the Goa State Level Virtual Celebration of International Day for Biological Diversity 2022. This is Reshma Kerkar, Scientific and Admin Officer, Goa State Biodiversity Board, accompanied by Ms. Simran Sharma, Intern of National Biodiversity Authority, extending a warm welcome and greetings to all on behalf of the Government of Goa, Department of Environment and Climate Change, and Goa State Biodiversity Board.
A very good morning to everyone present here. I am Simran Sharma, NBA intern working with GSBB. 22nd May is celebrated every year as the International Day for Biological Diversity to commemorate the adoption of Convention on Biological Diversity at the Earth Summit 1992. The theme adopted for this year is Building a Shared Future for All Life. The slogan was chosen to continue building momentum and support for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework to be adopted at the upcoming UN Convention Conference, that is the COP15.
We are also pleased to share with you that GSBB's team, including the Member Secretary GSBB, board members, selected BMC members, and Goan project team is at Chennai to attend the national level celebration where the activities and achievements of GSBB are being showcased. The state level formal function will be held in physical mode on 5th June 2022 from 3:30 p.m. onwards at Dr. S.Z. Kasim Auditorium of the National Institute of Oceanography, Dona Paula. All are cordially invited to attend the same too. We shall commence today's celebration with the welcome address by Dr. Pradeep Sarmukadam, Member Secretary, Goa State Biodiversity Board, who will elaborate on the theme for IDB 2022, which is Building a Shared Future for All Life.
Greetings to everyone on International Day of Biodiversity today. Our theme for this year is Building a Shared Future. This is such an important theme that we are not only species on this planet. We have other species, and being the dominant species on this planet, it is our responsibility to ensure that we not only live for ourselves, but we share the future of this planet with everybody. And if you ask me who is the main influencer of future, it is we all humans. Because we are influencing this planet in such a way that the whole future of the planet depends on our actions. And that's exactly why we have this theme, Building a Shared Future. And when we are talking about building a shared future, on today, we have all the biodiversity committees across the state who are joining us from various places. We are here in Chennai today, observing the national celebration of International Day for the Biodiversity. For the first time, we have a stall in Chennai, and on such a day, I am talking to all of you. And while we all know what is People's Biodiversity Register, we have done so much work. We have with us our chairperson, Shri Manoj sir, Honorable Minister for Environment and Climate Change. We also have Honorable Secretary of Environment and Climate Change, Shri Arun Kumar Mishra ji sir, who have always been supportive with us. And we have Director Shri Dashrath Redkar, who is continuously supporting us. So all of them together with today's faculty, with all our board members, and most important, all our biodiversity management committee chairpersons, members, village panchayats, municipalities, their councils, and all the people of Goa. We are not only observing, but we are celebrating International Day for Biodiversity. Why? Because we are endowed with rich biodiversity. We have everything right from the coastal ecosystems, the mudflat ecosystems, the mangrove ecosystems, the low-lying fields, we have hinterlands, we have grasslands, plateaus, and we have Western Ghat, which is blessing our state. And it is a constant endeavor that while we want to have a lot of development around us, the major challenge is how to conserve the environment while we have environmental degradation on one side. We also need to ensure that we have good livelihood support systems, we have good quality of life, but never at the cost of biodiversity, because biodiversity is a solution to every problem. It is never a part of problem, it is a part of solution. It is for us to decide whether we are a part of solution, which we thought last year. The theme was we are a part of solution. Before that, our solutions are in nature. So the whole world talks about the thing that our solutions are in nature. We are part of the solution, and now we are thinking not only about ourselves, but we are thinking about a shared future. And it depends on our every action, every footprint that we are going to create on this planet. What are we going to leave for our future? Future generations will decide on what we do today, what actions we do today. So let us vouch, let us pledge that we will conserve this planet. We will follow the traditional recipes, we will document the traditional recipes. We are having several competitions for this International Day. We will be having plantations under our plantation scheme. We have a project which is connecting livelihood to conservation. So while we do our livelihood activities, we can definitely do conservation if we believe in sustainable, non-destructive harvesting of resources, fair and equitable benefit sharing of resources, because that can only happen when we use our existing resources sustainably. And if we use them sustainably, then only we can conserve them. So while we have the top objective of conservation, till we hand it over to the next generation, I think it is time that we commit ourselves to green actions, we promote green skilling, we ensure that while no resources are wasted, no animal or the species around us should be deprived of their food, because they need very little food, and that's what all they need. So with this, I once again congratulate all of you for having joined us. We have a great lecture that we will hear about zoonotics and about how our actions can impact this planet, how irresponsibly if we do, how the zoonotic diseases can outbreak. We recently had a pandemic which we are just trying to come out of it, and we hope and we pray that we never have any pandemics. So considering this, I once again wish you all a very happy International Day of Biodiversity. Let us pledge ourselves to contribute for the Goa State Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, which will further lead into National Plan, and then we will be a part of the Post-Global 2020 framework, which is just being done by the global community, and we are having the first draft. So we have to work hard to plan for the next decade how we are going to plan the biodiversity conservation in our state by involving all of you, because we say that it is only with the people's participation, people's support and people's contribution that we are going to achieve the ultimate conservation of biodiversity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for the address. We will now proceed to the address by Shri Arun Kumar Mishra, IAS, Honorable Secretary, Environment and Climate Change, Government of Goa. Today's guest of honor.
मंत्री महोदय, प्यारे साथियों, 22 मई को विश्व जैव विविधता दिवस मनाया जाता है। जैसा कि आप जानते हैं, जैव विविधता का कॉन्सेप्ट आज मॉडर्न वर्ल्ड में बहुत तेज़ी से है और अपनी ब्रह्मांड को, अपनी पृथ्वी को बचाने के लिए इस पर बहुत एम्फेसिस दिया जाता है। लेकिन सबसे पहले हमारे वेदों ने इस जैव विविधता की बात की थी, जब उन्होंने कहा था सर्व खलविदं ब्रह्मम, कि इस संसार में जो कुछ है वो ब्रह्म है, यानी कि प्रत्येक जीव, चर, आचार, प्राणी, वस्तु, मानव जो भी है वो ब्रह्म का रूप है। इसलिए प्रत्येक व्यक्ति का सम्मान होना चाहिए, सभी अपनी सीमाओं में रहें, किसी की सीमा का कोई अतिक्रमण न करे और उन्हीं सीमाओं के तहत ब्रह्म से विलीन हो जाए। यदि इसी कॉन्सेप्ट को हम बायोडाइवर्सिटी के फॉर्मेट में डालें तो आज की साइंस, आज का विज्ञान यही कहते हैं कि जो भी बायोडाइवर्सिटी है, जो भी ब्रह्मांड में उत्पन्न है, वो अपनी सीमाओं में रहो, एक की कीमत पे दूसरे का विकास न हो और किसी के विकास को अवरुद्ध करके जैव विविधता का संतुलन न समाप्त किया जाए। इस अवसर पे भारत सरकार और गोवा सरकार महान प्रयास कर रही है, जिसके कारण कि हम SDG के गोल अचीव कर सकें, कार्बन एमिशन 2030 तक जीरो कर सकें, जिसमें सबसे अहम है डिफॉरेस्टेशन को कम किया जाना, कोस्टल इकोसिस्टम को मेंटेन करना, जिसमें हमारा कार्बन ब्लूप्रिंट जो है मैंग्रोव्स के द्वारा और वहाँ का जो हमारा कोस्टल इकोसिस्टम है उसका स्टोरेज बढ़ाना, जिससे कि टोटल कार्बन एमिशन में कमी आए और कार्बन जीरो का हम लक्ष्य प्राप्त कर सकें। ये हमारे गोवा सरकार के और भारत सरकार के महती लक्ष्य हैं। आज इस दिवस पे मैं सबसे अपेक्षा करता हूँ कि हम सामूहिक रूप से इन प्रयासों को जारी रखेंगे, आगे बढ़ाएंगे, जिससे कि हम विश्व को उसी रूप में पुनः ले जा सकेंगे जिसमें कि हमारे वैदिक ऋषियों और मुनियों ने कल्पना की थी। आधुनिक सुविधाओं के सहित ये नया विश्व हमारे लिए बहुत मंगलकारी होगा। धन्यवाद।
Extremely grateful, sir, for taking time from your busy schedule to address us on the occasion of International Day for Biological Diversity. Next, we have the address by our chief guest, Shri Nilesh Kabral, sir, Honorable Minister for Environment and Climate Change and Chairperson, Goa State Biodiversity Board.
Greetings to one and all on the International Day of Biodiversity 2022. This year's theme is building a shared future for all life. We have been working for last 2 years in various themes. Our biodiversity, our food, our health is what we have to conserve. And that is why we always say that the worldly pleasures which we have with us and the riches what we get are from something else. But when it comes to our lifestyles, we ultimately have to depend on biodiversity. Today, as chairman of Goa Biodiversity, I would like to be very happy to say that we are working for the last many years where we have seen and taken bold decisions. From no wetlands, we have notified 7 wetlands and we are in the process of notifying another 6. And we hope by the end of this year, we will be able to notify many such wetlands which were never taken care of. We have also notified one of our biodiversity heritage sites in Sulla, where after notifying, we have involved people and started a multi-processing centers under the brand name Goven. And it gives me immense pleasure to say that for the last 1.5 years, the multi-processing plant, which was inaugurated at the hands of Honorable CM, Dr. Pramod Sawant, in Pali, is running successfully well, and people there are involved totally. And taking this example, we have recently commissioned a second multi-processing center at Kuchare in Pantamol. We have also taken the step of growing plants where we were involved in MOPA construction, the newly airport which is being constructed in Goa, where we took the honors of replanting almost more than 1 lakh of plants and monitoring its growth. This is what we have been doing and we want to do. Some of our biodiversity committees are really working well. Some of them have done Shram Shakti, say Jal Samruddhi. And I'm really happy to say that Chodan, Madal, BMC, Ponda, cleaning by Kurti Kandeparkar BMC, and also Wagurme BMC, like maintenance of lakes. It is something which they have done voluntarily, and I think all other people of Goa, all other BMCs should take this forward, like how they have been doing it. We are one of the first boards in the entire country where ODOP scheme of doing upgradation plan under the Prime Minister's formulation of micro food processing under DOITC has been taken up. We are also taking up specific projects such as through ZSI and PSI, intellects from the states where they can share their movements so that we can work in a better prospect. We have engaged more than 60 experts through 16 subcommittees on various ecosystems for the state, and we have made a state action plan for the next decade. Let us all, it is not only me or my team, but let us all work together with the state and the communities for preserving our future. With this, I would like once again, in wishing you all along with us a very happy International Day of Biodiversity 2022. Thank you.
Thank you, Cabral sir, for your constant support to the Member Secretary GSBB and team to forge ahead with new and better initiatives towards fulfilling the mandate of the Biological Diversity Act 2002 and achieving the conservation of the rich biodiversity of our state of Goa is blessed with. We now have a brief experience sharing account by Dr. Mahendra Bale, Chairperson, Ambauli Biodiversity Management Committee from Kepe Taluka in South Goa. He will be addressing us in Konkani.
हांव दोतोर महेंद्र बाळे, चेअरपर्सन आंबावली बायोडायवर्सिटी मॅनेजमेंट कमिटी. आंबावली हो आमचो केपे तालुक्यातली एक पंचायत. त्या पंचायतीक मे 2015 ह्या सालाक आमी ठराव घेतलो की आंबावली बायोडायवर्सिटी मॅनेजमेंट कमिटीन काम करचें आनी आमकां बायोडायवर्सिटी मॅनेजमेंट बोर्डाचो खुबसो आदार जालो. ताजे नंतर आमी सुरवातेक आमकां बायोडायवर्सिटी म्हणजे कितें हेंच खबर नाशिल्लें. मागीर आमकां कळपाक लागलें बायोडायवर्सिटी म्हणजे त्या गांवांक आशिल्ली, त्या एरियेक आशिल्ली जनावरां आसत, पक्षी आसत, मायक्रो ऑर्गॅनिजम्स आसत किंवा अळमी आसत, हे सगळे जे कितें आसा ते म्हळ्यार जैव विविधता. त्या भागातली जैव विविधता म्हणजे बायोडायवर्सिटी. हे आमकां जेन्ना कळ्ळें तेन्ना आमी एक आमची ग्रामसभा घेतली. सगळे लोकां कडेन आमी उलयले आनी मागीर आमकां कळपाक लागलें की आमकां खुबशे लोक आमच्या गांवांक आसात, जशे की खुशाली देकर म्हूण आसा किंवा मारिया फेर्नांडीस म्हूण आसा, दुमियाना रेबेलो म्हूण आसा, जी खुबश्या वर्सां पासून थंडेचें वखद दिलें, काळमणीचें वखद दिलें, मागीर पायल्सांचें वखद दिलें, जिवाण्यान घांसमलें वखद दिलें अडकी म्हणून, मागीर मिल्क सिक्रेशना खातीर गांठ म्हणून, इतलीं वर्सां आमची गांवां आसा हें आमकां दिसलें. ताजेर आमी फुडें वचून काम करतकच आमच्या गांवांक वेगवेगळे तरेचे आमचे पक्षी आसात हें आमकां दिसलें. जशें की व्हडलीं व्हडलीं नांवां आसा पूण ते पक्षी आमची गांवां आसात. 200 ते 250 जातीचे पक्षी आमची गांवां आसात हें आमकां दिसलें. उदाहरणार्थ आमचे जंगल मैना आसा, व्हायट बेलीड बुश चॅट, जंगल बबलर, ब्लॅक हुडेड ओरियोल, व्हायट बेलीड ड्रंगो, कॉमन एओरा, टिकल्स ब्लू फ्लाय कॅचर ही आनी खंयची न्ही, हे पक्षी आमच्या गांवांत अजून आसात. कारण एक मनीस बेंगलोरच्यान हल्ली आयलो, 2-2.5 लाख रुपयाचो आपलो DSLR कॅमेरा हल्ली एप्रील म्हयन्याक, आनी तो आमच्या गांवां भोंवन ताणें सांगलें तुमच्या गांवां 250 पक्षी आपूण फोटो काडून दवरल्यात, थोडीशीं नांवां थोडेशे फोटो आमकां धाडले. ताजे नंतर फुडें वतना आमकां कळ्ळें की झाडां पळयली जाल्यार बिबय ट्री, बिबयेचें म्हणून एक बरे तरेचें झाड आसा, तें आमकां कन्जर्व कर अशें आमकां हाजे कडल्यान आयिल्लें आसा. आमच्या बायोडायवर्सिटी जेन्ना आमचो PBR डॉक्युमेंटेशन जालें, आमकां 18 फेब्रुवारी 2020 आमचो डॉक्युमेंटेशन जालें, आनी आमकां इकलय सावथ गोवा हांचे टॅक्निकल सपोर्ट ग्रूप ताणें आमकां मदत केली. आमच्या गांवांत बावो बावो अशीं झाड आसा, ताजे नंतर लक्ष्मी तरू झाडां आसात, अशीं खुबशीं वेगळीं झाडां आसात. अळम्याची जात्यो तर आमच्यो इतल्यो आसात, तातूंत भितर जपानीस अम्ब्रेला, एगॅरिकस कम्पेस्ट्रीस, वॉल्वरिएला अश्यो वेगवेगळ्यो जाती हे आसात. तर सांगपाचें अशें की प्रत्येक गांवांत आपल्या जाग्यार आशिल्ली जैव विविधता, बायोडायवर्सिटी म्हणजे वेगवेगळे प्रकारचे जनावरां आसत, पक्षी आसत, अळमे आसत, झाडां आसत, औषधी वनस्पती आसत, ह्यो सगळ्यो कन्जर्व करून दवरप आनी बाकीच्या भायल्या लोकां पसून म्हणजे ताजें हें वचचें डिस्ट्रक्शन जावचें न्ही, तें सोंपचें न्ही. कारण आज बायोडायवर्सिटी तशी झाडां जनावरां साद्यो मुयो आसत, सादे किटक आसत, सादे टोळ आसत. पयलीं तेंपां आमकां दिसतालें भिरमुटी दिसताल्यो, टोळ दिसताले, फुलपाखरां दिसतालीं, आतां तीं दिसनात. सो ती ज्या जाग्यार आसा त्या जाग्यार कन्जर्व करप, ही बायोडायवर्सिटी जर टिकलें जाल्यार जीवन टिकतलें. जीवन म्हणजेच बायोडायवर्सिटी. आमकां संदी बायोडायवर्सिटी मॅनेजमेंट बोर्डान दिली, इकलय सावथ गोवान आमकां आदार केलो, म्हज्या गांवच्या लोकांचो खुबसो आदार मेळ्ळो, आनी आमचो PBR फेब्रुवारी 2020 वॅलिडेट जाला, तो डॉक्युमेंट जाल्लो आसा, आनी तशें आमी फुडें काम करीत आसात. देव बरें करूं.
Dev Bhare Karu, Dr. Bale. Thank you for sharing your experience of documentation of the Ambauli Village People's Biodiversity Register and also briefly explaining the steps towards the final validation of the register as well as arriving at a conservation focus area and outcome of the documentation of People's Biodiversity Register, especially when done with involvement of the local villagers. Next, we shall hear the experience of Sri Alvito Joseph August de Silva, ex-secretary, Pomburpa Olauli Biodiversity Management Committee from Bardes Taluka of North Goa. He is a fine example of a motivated government servant who volunteered to be the secretary of the Biodiversity Management Committee and has been solely responsible for encouraging his fellow chairperson, members, and villagers to prepare a very well documented and presented People's Biodiversity Register.
Pomurpa and Olauli are very beautiful villages. The panchayat of these villages is made up of 7 wards, each with its unique character. For Pomurpa, water is life. It springs forth wealth for the village and health and wealth for its inhabitants. Now, how to conserve this biodiversity? The People's Biodiversity Register is in good position to conserve the biodiversity. Now, preparing the biodiversity register of this village was an Herculean task, but one with immense joy and satisfaction. Soon after the TSG was appointed by the Goa State Biodiversity Board, the BMC of Pomurpa Olauli along with the TSG started its meetings with the villagers. We also met resourceful individuals. Every resourceful individual was met. And we also had long transect through the length and breadth of the village of Pomurpai and Olauli. Every encounter an opportunity for data. Every observation a source for information. The data collected was then cross-checked with two. One, the experts in their respective fields, and also by referring to authentic websites online. This information was then converted into and called source reports. The source reports containing uncontaminated data were then skillfully processed by the data team. The data was filled in the formats provided by the Goa State Biodiversity Board. There are in total 29 for the rural areas and 31 for the urban areas. So we have to fill a total of 29 formats provided by the Goa State Biodiversity Board with information collected from the village. In addition to filling the formats, we also included or incorporated two unique features in our PBR. The one is known as two-way audit trail, wherein you could check in two ways the correctness of the data and also refer to the data source. And second was the GIS mapping. Now this is a unique feature incorporated in the PBR, and the credit for this goes to the technical support group and its leader Savio Fonseca. A few revisions to the PBR were then made, taking into consideration the contribution made in the Gram Sabha. The completed PBR was then approved by all concerned and subsequently validated. I would like to show you the completed PBR of our village. This is having all the data of the village with respect to the rich biodiversity. It has the main logo on its front page, and it consists of full-scape pages, more than 169 in number. Also contains beautiful pictures of the village. The future plans of this BMC includes regular updating of data and also working on making the Pomurpa Spring a biodiversity heritage site. We intend to use the information collected already for three purposes. One is to conserve the rich biodiversity, to put it to sustainable use, and also facilitate fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising therein. It is my ardent appeal to the BMCs to take a serious look at your PBRs and to complete it and also update it regularly. This will help the present generation and all the future generations to come. Rich biodiversity can only yield rich dividends.
Thank you, sir, for the experience sharing. Before we proceed with today's guest lecture, a brief introduction about the guest speaker, Dr. Manoj Ramakant Borkan, a MSc Gold medalist, a PhD from Mumbai with a list of added degrees, a scientist, a scholar in wildlife biology, versatile academician, a barefoot ecologist with ground connect, also a poet, thinker, committed ecologist, author, lexicographer, columnist, first awardee in Higher Education 2015 as Goa State Meritorious Teacher, former member of the Goa State Biodiversity Board, former member of the State Wildlife Board for 3 consecutive terms, former member of Goa State Expert Appraisal Committee, founder of the Biodiversity Research Cell and Associate Professor, Department of Zoology, Carmel College for Women, Nueve Goa. Well known for his contribution in documenting faunal biodiversity ranging from insects, arachnids, fishes, crocodiles, bats, large carnivores, including Asiatic lions and aquatic mammals. He has done pioneering work on crocodiles of Kumbarzoa Canal and their conservation status, earning a place in IUCN's Crocodile Specialist Group. He has strived beyond the call of his profession and duty to conserve the rich biodiversity of the state of Goa. On the occasion of International Day for Biological Diversity 2022, Goa State Biodiversity Board proudly presents lecture by today's guest speaker, Dr. Manoj Ramakant Borkan. All the participants are requested to type your questions in the chat box.
Namaskar, a very good morning to everybody here. This is Dr. Manoj Borkan from the Department of Zoology at Carmel College for Women, from the Syrian village of Nueve in Sasti, Salsett, Goa. It's a pleasure to connect with everybody this morning, and once again a very warm greetings of the International Day for Biological Diversity. It feels very good to connect with you and share some of my views on this important day and remind all of us of our responsibility towards the custodianship of the living wealth of this planet and how important it is for everybody to play a role in our own spheres of activity and resources available to us. And of course, with the backdrop of the recent pandemic, the aftermath of which we are still reeling in probably all walks of our life. But at the outset, of course, I would be very happy and honored to take cognitions of presence of our Honorable Minister for Environment, Nilesh Bab Cabral, for all his support, encouragement, and staunch support that comes from him to the State Biodiversity Board and everybody, all of us, the stakeholders of biodiversity. Of course, also to the Officer of Indian Administrative Service, Shri Mishraji, who is the Secretary of Environment for the state government. Your presence is extremely encouraging and we welcome you, sir. To, of course, the Member Secretary of the State Biodiversity Board, Dr. Pradeep Sarmakadam, who's been the driving force of all activities and action happening from the State Biodiversity Board. Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this important program this morning and requesting me to speak on a very pertinent theme of zoonosis, biodiversity conservation, and the implications thereof. So I think before we begin, it would be very important for me to kind of just reflect with all of you on the contemporary scenario, the last 2 years that we have been going through a lot of difficulties on account of this invisible, ultra tiny enemy that we choose to call as the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which is what has given us this COVID-19 pandemic that has been sweeping the globe, and it's still not over. We have been having advisories all along not to lower our guard, to stay alert, to bring about certain modifications in the way we conduct ourselves in public space, to take the requisite precautions. I think it's been one significant, overwhelming microbe, or I would rather say a kind of entity that has influenced our lives in a big way in all spheres of our activities, be it economy, be it ecology, be it sociology. I mean, it has restricted our social interactions. It has demolished global economies. It has probably confined us through quarantines and a lot of restriction on our movements. It has assured a fresh wave of people being driven into poverty and demolished all the efforts thus far into poverty alleviation. But more than anything, it has brought back a lot of limelight on one of the most misunderstood and I would say less understood species of the mammalian kingdom, which of course is, the reference very obviously is to the bats, which are the only flying mammals that we have in the animal kingdom. So this morning I thought as a zoology student and a faculty who's been attempting to speak to my students since last 34 years on various interesting spin-offs on the way the animals get distributed on the planet, the way they move, the implications of their movement close to human spaces, how we overlap human settlements with wild spaces, what is the consequence thereof, and how do we respond to this kind of a crisis, and if at all we've learned any lessons, how do we accrue that information and allow it to translate or manifest into a policy or an action that will sustain us through more such emerging novel pathogens, or maybe even the resurgence of the existing pathogens. So I think this reflection is going to be, I will attempt to keep it quite simple and lucid, avoiding all technicalities, but you will agree with me, this is a fairly technical subject that cuts through the domains of zoology, medicine, virology, sociology, molecular biology, and what have you, and immunology, and so on and so forth. Most importantly, it's also got to do with the way we relate to our nature, and I think a lasting solution towards minimizing the impact of this pandemic would be necessarily something that will require of our species as human beings, supposedly a very intelligent a species on this planet, which can manipulate using our science and technology all the available resources. At the same time, we have the requisite understanding and knowledge systems with us and all kinds of sci-tech know-how to ensure that all this living heritage and living wealth, which probably is hosted by only one planet in the solar system, which we inhabit, called the Earth. Having said that, if we want to respond to this situation, a crisis, a kind of a catastrophe that has hit us very badly in the last 2 years, we will have to do a lot of integration of domains. The answers cannot come from a single domain. And least of all, it's not the exclusive prerogative or responsibility of the medical science to look at the etiology, the causes and the effects and the aftermath, and maybe more importantly, the prophylaxis of preventive measures. So I think we should all be looking at some kind of an exercise in hand-holding where we draw expertise from multiple knowledge domains, which will include biology, very importantly on the forefront, wildlife biology. We may have to take a lot of inputs from zoologists and wildlife biologists, while also wanting to have virologists on board. We will have to, of course, talk to the local community in understanding their perception. Attitudes of people towards animals are very important in defining our interaction with the animals, so this is very important. We will also have to engage in a sort of a dialogue with the local communities and the entire spectrum of biodiversity stakeholders, which is to include the governments as well, the forest departments too, the local governing bodies or at the grassroots levels, which of course very much includes your biodiversity management committee, the local community, probably the Goa State Biodiversity Board, the Department of Environment, Department of Forest and Wildlife, the academia and the common man. We all shall stand together in resolving that we face this crisis pragmatically with a mission to avoid any such repetition of, I would say, a viral pandemic calamity. So to start with, I think it's very important to understand basically what exactly are these zoonotic diseases and how exactly has this particular virus, which is called a SARS-CoV-2, which, as I said before, is the virus which is responsible for causing all the pain and mortality. The mortality graphs have been very significant. So how exactly did this virus enter the human population is the first question that I would really like to address in this talk to commemorate the International Day for Biological Diversity. So as we all know, we have been the victims of this calamity since last probably December 2019 was when the outbreak happened in Wuhan, in China, People's Republic of China. And then it did not take long time for the virus to start assaulting people from all over the world. And in a matter of few months, through the travel and tourism portal, it entered probably the first state to have been reporting the first case of SARS-CoV-2 was Kerala. And then it started unleashing its terror, sweeping through all the states of the country. So, I mean, this is very important. It has devastated us psychologically, it has devastated us physiologically or physically, which is the health. It has devastated us economically, and in many ways, the world is still battling this terrible enemy. It seems to be far from over. The mortality graphs are still sending tremors across the medical fraternity, and while it seems that it's just settling down and we're just about to declare that it's over and start normalizing our lives, there again you have an alarm coming from World Health Organization saying and alerting everybody that it's not over. You kindly continue taking the requisite precautions in public space and wear your face mask, use your sanitizers, avoid crowding, minimize your socialization unless it's absolutely necessary. And there's a big list of do's and don'ts. I think these fears and uncertainty about the genesis, where it all started from and where is it going is, it's still very incomplete. Our understanding of this pandemic called COVID-19 is far from being complete. What we know is only what we know thus far, and we need to investigate much more. There have been a lot of conspiracy theories. There has been a lot of falsehood that's being spread by some countries from where the virus is believed to have probably entered into human domain through some kind of accidental spillage in the laboratory. There was a lot of talk about the Wuhan virology lab where this virus is said to have been reservoired strictly for medical research purpose. And as you know, and all of us know, sometimes in science you do have accidents which can trigger a lot of fatality. And then there was this talk about how the Chinese, on account of their very curious, I would say, because food is a matter of culture and we have no business to point fingers at anybody's eating habits. But having said that, the use of wild meat, which also includes a range of animals like bats and you've got pangolins, both of which have now been implicated in the reservoiring of a cocktail of viral pathogens. And of course, how some of these viruses could have, through an intermediate host, which is pangolin. You have approximately 4 species of pangolins in Asia. And probably some of these which were also being traded in the Wuhan wet market for edible purpose or maybe as a pet trade or whatever it is, irrespective of the reasons for which this wildlife was brought in proximity of human settlements, whether for the purpose of food or pet trade or whatever. I think that's how the virus eventually got a portal of transfer from the bat through the pangolins into the human population. To start with, it was very endemic. It was confined to a small community in Wuhan, but it did not take long before the virus mutated along this trade route, or maybe during this transference from the bats through the pangolin into the human population, it gained the requisite properties in terms of being able to attach to receptive surfaces, the compatibility with the new hosts, and quickly invaded the human population. Then from then till date, you've got a great number of variants, and the tug of war seems to be going on. On one side, we try to accelerate our vaccine research alongside all the preventive measures. On the other side, the virus is constantly trying to outsmart the medical science and mutating its protein coat and whatever it takes to attach to surfaces within the body and eventually start incubating and multiplying in our body. So this is very interesting, and one lesson that all of us would probably have to learn is never attempt to outsmart nature. Nature can certainly teach us a few lessons, and we need to admit that whatever little we know, and all the flamboyance and arrogance that we display about our science and technology has got limitations. And I think the virus is there for all of you to make us understand this truth. So medical fraternity now is very desperately seeking to understand how to prevent this catastrophe of an immense scale. How do you deal with this pandemic transference and transmission? Well, you start with the virus being shared, the virus being transferred. There's kind of a spillover, shedding. Then that's how you contaminate new hosts, and that's how you transfer it further into human population. So this is being debated. These various the aspects of transmission dynamics, as you call it technically, are still being looked into. They are being debated, and I must confess, with limited understanding that I personally have of virology, and the general wisdom on the entire gamut of issues is that we still do not know enough for us to feel confident that we will be able to overcome the present crisis, as also maybe have the requisite knowledge and infrastructure and the policy and the machinery and mechanism to avert a future viral spillover like this. So we need to be all the time alert. So this is again very, very important. So as I've said before, and let me reiterate, from accidental spillage to some sort of conspiracy theories, you've got multiple hypotheses that have been floated by people. There has been a lot of debate, there has been a lot of arguments, there has been a lot of falsehood that's being spread, and if I may put it, proverbial jigsaw puzzle, we need to fit the pieces. It's still not very clear to us, but one thing we know for sure, and that is what makes us call this a zoonosis or a zoonotic disease, that it is basically a pathogen. Technically, you define a zoonotic disease as anything which comes from, the source is an animal which eventually can transfer it to another animal, also to the human beings. So a zoonotic disease is basically a pathogen. It could also be a parasite, it could be a bacterium, it could be a virus, it could be a parasite which is primarily confined to, I don't like the word lower vertebrates, but that's to differentiate our species from the rest of it. But that's the reservoir, that's where it is basically existing, and there's some sort of a state of equilibrium between that original host, which is now its reservoir, that seems to have struck a balance in terms of the immune response of the host and the ability of the virus to trigger a pathological change. Is almost at equilibrium. So the original host does not really manifest into any kind of a disease, but the minute it gets transferred into human host, it's a new host where the immune system of a human being may take some time to respond to this kind of unwanted foreign antigen that has just invaded its body, while the virus is ready with all its arsenal and start damaging the system. So this is something very interesting again. So I think it's very, very important for all of us as lay people, as people of science, and also for the governments, before we seriously start doing a lot of brainstorming, sitting together and trying to attempt to find answers not only to the origins and where has this virus come from, but also how long is it going to stay within the human population, and what is the ultimate end story. How long would it take for the virus to be declared as over? I mean, the pandemic. The virus cannot be declared as over. Of course, it's going to be there, but its ability to cause pathogenicity in the human population is definitely going to be limited, because that's evolution. And that is how we respond to this kind of foreign antigens, even if it's viral antigen. At some point of time, your body will eventually kind of adapt and get into a state of immune equilibrium with the viral antigen and the ability of this virus to cause a disease. So, but it should all start with this question, the origins have to be investigated. It's, as I said before, not a task of one single domain or one single person. It may now be a human disease and receives a lot of attention from an anthropogenic, very heavy anthropogenic focus on the virus, but we need to understand that the virus begins from an animal. I mean, it essentially begins from a wild space. And for some reasons, it's being introduced accidentally, or we do not really know how it comes, but there are very interesting portals of transmission of what is primarily a microbe of wild spaces spilling over into the human space. That's quite a challenging proposition. So this is something very, very important. And I need to say this with a lot of conviction. A lot of people still ask whether this is really a human disease or something which was in the bat that eventually became like the monster, or a Jenny in a bottle which was stoppered. You open the bottle and pops out the Jenny and says, "Now I'm going to demolish everybody, eat you up all." More or less, that's the kind of analogy. I need to say this, that the original strain of this virus has been something called as the bat cove rat G13. That was the virus, the prototype, the progenitor. The progenitor virus of SARS-CoV-2 has been something which was fairly at an equilibrium with its original host, and that is the bat. And bats do not normally live, they do share space with human beings, but they are secluded, they are recluse. They live either they have roosting sites, and they've got some kind of cavities and caverns and crevices that they occupy. A lot of them, of course, forage in maybe horticultural landscapes, or probably frugivores, that is, fruit-eating bats could probably be regularly visitors to your gardens, and that's when they come in close contact with the human environment, the human landscape. Or this is how you bring in an unwanted guest, hitchhiking on a bat, which is a regular visitor in your backyard, and then probably the common element of interest to both of you is the fruit, which the bat enjoys and so do you. And probably when the bat nibbles there, or when it urinates or defecates, some of the body fluids which are now loaded with the viral pathogen. The viral load is also a very critical point in this sort of decision on whether this viral transfer is really going to be a pandemic in its intensity or magnitude. So this is very, very important that we know, as far as, there have been a lot of zoonotic diseases. We're still talking about SARS-CoV-2 because, and then we're talking about the bats, which very unfortunately have been demonized. A lot of negative attention that the bats have garnered since December 2019, because somebody said this virus has originated in the bats and that's where from it has come. You start destroying and disturbing the bat roosts, you start indiscriminately killing the bats, and you want to completely eradicate, and that's something terrible. Because not all bats do carry this virus. This virus is very specifically known to be residing in the horseshoe bats of a certain genus and species. And we're not too sure, of course, whether the SARS-CoV-2 hosting bats are, what is their distribution, what is their range, what is their zoo geography is still a matter of research, and there are very critical gaps in our understanding. But I would just like to mention, as we speak about the zoonotic disease, rabies. You have the Ebola virus, you've got the HIV, you've got the SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome, right? And this SARS-CoV-2 is again something very similar. Or you've got the MERS. MERS is Middle East respiratory syndrome disease, which came from the camels in the Middle East. So any kind of interaction which brings human beings in close proximity with the wildlife, for whatever reason, it may be because of trade, commerce, you want to get into intensive agriculture, you want to do some kind of animal factory farming, you want to probably trade in wild meats, you want to probably have a pet trade, whatever be the reasons. If you encroach into wild spaces because of your urban sprawl, you try to push in your agriculture and your settlement zones in the wilderness, I think that's exactly what I'm talking about, that you inadvertently, without your knowledge, get too dangerously close to this, the primary host, or the primary reservoir, if that's the right word, in fact, where you have this virus just waiting to jump species. And that's basically the interspecific boundary violation, that what has been now confined until now, right, been confined to a particular host with which it has struck a equilibrium, right? So it's fine, it's okay. You harbor it, but you have nothing to suffer from as far as the bat is concerned. The minute it jumps the species, and now it's a new host, new environment is trying to quickly adapt. It's undergoing certain modulations, it's going some sort of mutations, it's trying to maximize the benefits it can, and the ultimate objective is to multiply. And it multiplies, and it causes a lot of distress because it's got pathogenic potential. So this is basically very important, that when we talk about zoonotic diseases, it's not just about SARS-CoV-2, really speaking, but it's got something to do with many more viral, bacterial, and I mean, you do also have parasitic infestations, many of which originate from the animals and eventually spill over into human populations. So how does a disease of animals really pose a threat to human beings who are all the time living in the cozy confines of their safe, secure mansions and homes? You don't really, kind of get into the forest and compete for space, and you don't share that space, really speaking, quote unquote, with the wildlife. But for whatever purpose that you go to the forest, either it's logging, it's got to do for, with collection. Your dependence on the forest is also a driver, right? Your dependence on the forest is also a driver. I mean, if you're actually regularly cropping some resources from forest, that's also one way. There's a conduit for transfer. So this is again very, very important, that you have a few drivers which make situation more easy for the virus to violate that confinement within its primary host, and this interspecific bridge, so to say, is crossed by the virus, essentially because you're getting dangerously close to the virus now. And therefore, this is a critical piece of information in any sort of policy planning for preventive measures, that you need to maintain the integrity of wild spaces, and you're not supposed to violate that sanctity of a wild space for whatever reasons, whatever economic benefits and whatever economic incentives that you can think about, if it's going to take a toll on the wild habitats with which you share space, but you need to stay in your limits, and that sort of staying in limits would be reciprocated by many of this wildlife. So I think this is the basis of the whole discussion, that you need to eliminate the transmission points where the wildlife is likely to come in contact with human beings. And there are many such transmission points. In the beginning, I did speak to you about pet trade, I did speak to you about wildlife trade, I did speak to you about commercial logging, I did speak to you about intensive agriculture, I did speak to you about livestock rearing on almost a commercial scale, which is going to require a lot of space. So whether you like it or not, you continuously encroaching on the wild habitats, you're getting closer and closer and closer, as I say, dangerously closer to these wild animals. So I think we now need to look at some sort of a profound change in the way we produce our foods. We need to also look at the consumption patterns. I know of a lot of these Mexican chefs who kind of keep on luring international tourists and visitors to Latin America with the the lure of caiman meat or anaconda meat, right? I mean, that sounds so fancy that anyone who's really tired of eating a regular chicken, pork, mutton, beef, what have you, or fish, you certainly have a craving for something exotic and something different, but that's going to make you pay a price for that. That if you want to be adventurous, gastronomic adventure is going to cost you in terms of your health and your life, probably. Because every time you have in your plate a meat or anaconda, or you have meat of a crocodile or something like caiman, which is a crocodile species, you're rendering yourself extremely vulnerable to the entry of this what are basically the animal pathogens which are slowly gaining entry in your system, right? So that's something that you need to understand. You have to be able to suppress wildlife trade, which is illegal. Mind you, you do also have legal wildlife trade, which is done with proper permits, which is regimented and regulated. You know, the quantum of wildlife artifacts or trade material that you're actually, kind of taking and trading with, it's not a free-for-all situation, and there is a better monitoring of legal wildlife trade. But I'm talking about the illegal wildlife trade, where in a total indifference to the law of the land, you keep on over-harvesting. It's a clandestine trade, and I need to say in the same breath that China is the biggest exporter of wildlife meat as also wildlife artifacts, and the United States of America is the biggest importer of that. And I think it's not just about wildlife meat, but it's also about traditional Chinese medicines, or what we call as TCMs. So TCM, or traditional Chinese medicine, is not only got to do with meats, but many other parts of the body, including, for instance, the pangolin scales are supposed to be one of the finest and the most indispensable ingredient in the Chinese, the traditional Chinese medicine. So obviously, where there's a demand, there's going to be a supply, and where the supply is meant to be regimented, there's going to be a kind of a gray market and a lot of undercurrents in terms of smuggling this contraband to obviously benefit more. So these are some of the important things. A very important thing that we need to understand is the need to protect and conserve natural habitats. This is something very, very important. Kindly remember, when we speak about the wildlife, it's not just about the space requirement. In most of our discussions, when we talk about habitat, we generally look at habitat from a spatial dimension, which means to an untrained mind, habitat is only space where the animal needs to probably exist, probably kind of rest and whatever. But trust me, a habitat is something more than a physical space, and that's where you make to the animal available the mates, the water requirements. It needs a cover. It has to have optimal chances of survival. It has to be in a state of good health and vigor. And if all these attributes and requirements are met by the attributes of the habitat, if the habitat matrices are commensurate with the requirement of the species, and that's what qualifies to be a habitat. And therefore, what I'm trying to simply say, I'm not trying to bog you with a lot of technical words, as much as I'm trying to tell you that the sanctity, which means the importance, of a habitat should never be violated. In simple words, if something is declared as a habitat for the wildlife, it has to be preserved, it has to be protected, it has to be conserved for posterity, not just of your species, but for that species to continue to survive and leave descendants. Otherwise, you're going to lose out on that species. And a loss of a single species from the planet Earth tantamounts to an irreversible genetic impoverishment, which means you lose that species, you lose a certain chunk of genes from the total gene pool of this planet forever. You can't get it back, really speaking. You may attempt number of gimmicks using biotechnology and molecular biology, recombinant, whatever, the whole tongue twisters in the so-called domain of white coat biology. The fact remains you can't get the animal back. We all have this whole story about the Indian cheetah. They're struggling now. We're begging of Iran and Namibia to gift us a few breeding pairs, and you want to you want to see the cheetah back in your jurisdiction, political jurisdiction. Imagine you lose out on something, and then you want to restore that. I'm trying to bring it back. How do you do that, really? You have to beg, you have to ask. And then you are at the mercy of people to oblige you or not oblige you. So I think it makes more sense to preserve what you already have with you, rather than look at policies and frameworks that are more towards restoration. I personally always believed that protection is better than restoration. Restoration is something that you would have to be doing when you lost everything, you restore it. But protection is far better. As you say, prevention is better than cure. The same story here. Protection is far better than restoration. So this is very important. If you look at the current demands of wild meat from the global markets, they're very significant. I have already spoken to you about the need to have smart, tailored response to pandemics and integrate that with the larger domain of wildlife conservation. I repeat what I've said before, that you cannot really look at defensive reactions like strengthening healthcare. I mean, if all of you remember, I do not really think of any government, whether it is a local government, whether it is at the probably the national level or maybe even international governments, were all the time talking about strengthening and reinforcing the public healthcare sector. I think there was very little talk about understanding the connect of the pandemic with wild spaces. Nobody spoke about that, except for this excitement on how, because of the closing down of our cities and public amenities, how the wildlife started entering human settlements, and those images that flashed in the social media platforms. But I think that's the whole escape. I mean, that's what we fail to notice. The connect of the pandemic with wild species is a crucial element of the entire discussion. So, and that's exactly what I'm saying. Governments must very clearly understand that investing in this kind of reactive strategies or defense reactions, which are limited in the scope of, how would I say, time and efficacy, you kind of invest immensely in upgrading a health infrastructure. That's a reactive strategy. It's going to be there. You probably, as long as the wave lasts, and then after the wave, you have the whole infrastructure lying unused, right? At what cost? And then again, you wait for another wave. God forbid it doesn't happen, and very soon I hope the pandemic is declared closed by World Health Authority. You don't. It's only for the World Health Organization to declare. I say this with a lot of conviction, to declare the pandemic as being over. It can't be a local, agency or a medical specialist or some kind of government, whether at a grassroots levels or state level or the national level, to say the pandemic is over. It could be over in terms of the immediate repercussions, or at that point of time, going by your zero surveillance data, you say, well, in India you don't have it, or maybe it'll take another 4 months for a new wave to emerge. The point is simply, COVID-19 has not been declared as over by the World Health Organization, and therefore all that you do in the interim time if it's reactive, is not really going to fetch you any return. So what exactly would be, looking at this pandemic in terms of a transnational approach, or maybe a global mandate? You just can't have knee-jerk reactions and end up with hiccups every time you have a new wave. You have to look at the whole thing in the light of reshaping your responses. Probably global production and supply chains involving wildlife meat or wild meat or wildlife products would have to be really looked at very seriously, and otherwise all your reactive strategies are going to be very ineffective. As I speak to you, and just for all of us to know, I am speaking to you about the connect between zoonotic diseases, which I've already said are diseases that arise in lower vertebrates, so animals normally get confined there. But given the right combination of factors, they can jump from one species to another, and that's what you call as a spillover interface. You need to identify this. So what are the challenges before us? And before I get into that, I need to say this once again with some responsibility, that if somebody thought that, well, COVID-19 has taught us enough lessons, we know enough, and we know everything about how to deal with viruses and viral pandemics and pathogens, well, that's a fallacy. We really do not know enough. What we know is just, I would say, what we know until now. There's much more to be known. Our understanding of the whole subject is only contemporary, it is not absolute. And there are a lot of critical gaps in our understanding, which are very important in some very important decisions that would have to be taken by multiple stakeholder agencies. So one, I want to say that emergence and resurgence of zoonotic diseases are inevitable, and we're going to witness many such viral emergences in our lifetime. Our lifetime is not very big, of course. Our total longevity is very, very minuscule on a scale of time. But yes, I have to say we have already lost millions of lives. I think we have also lost a lot of employment. We have displaced a lot of people occupationally. We have ushered in a new wave of poverty. Where all the efforts taken at poverty alleviations have been negated with these 2 years of standstill, a state of suspended animation when nothing was happening. Everybody waited and prayed and whatnot. We invested in prayers and the divine intervention. At the same time, a medical fraternity investing in a lot of hardcore research. Synergy probably, the goodwill, the blessings, the hard work of the scientists have paid. We've got fairly good candidates of vaccines, but that's not the end of the story. And this is what I'm trying to explain to you, that emergence and resurgence of this is going to repeat. So as I was saying before, the poverty alleviation efforts put in by the governments have been wasted. A lot of people have had to liquidate their assets. A lot of children, promising children, have discontinued with education. The potential knowledge capital is very questionable now, given this pandemic situation. People have not been able to sustain continuous academic investment. So, and people have very unfortunately, and this is something scary, a lot of people across the globe have got into illegal economies, which also includes smuggling, crime, and this kind of illicit trade portals. And that's because they're compelled to, kind of somehow secure their livelihood, whether through acceptable and legal portals or otherwise. I'm not trying to justify this. I'm just trying to explain to you what could be a fallout of a pandemic beyond your own health and, this whole notion about the morbidities and comorbidities and mortalities. We've almost got about 75% of the emerging diseases today are zoonotic, and that's a strong statement, which means out of 100 diseases that have been cited in medical literature, and I have a few names that I shared with you in the beginning, 75% are zoonotic because they originate in animals and eventually start, creating problems for our species. And it's very interesting
Extremely sorry for the brief gap. We were having some connectivity issues. We will now resume again.
Function of the viral load as to what is the number of viral particles in a unit volume of the body fluid is also a determinant. It's very interesting again. I've also said this before to you, so I shall not repeat that China is one of the largest exporters of wild meat, while United States of America has a lot that it imports in terms of wildlife meat and so on. I just give you one example of what happens when there are no proper checks in terms of this kind of imports and exports. A particular zoonotic fungus entered America. It's basically called the chytrid fungus, which normally affects amphibians. And a good number of endemic species of America have been threatened because of the fungus that got introduced into the United States, maybe from somewhere else, because there were no proper border checks. And you may ask me, were the frogs brought in for the purpose of eating as they do in this very state where we sit and we're talking about the need to conserve biodiversity? I believe a lot of tourists who come and ask, where could we be getting jumping chicken? The season has just begun. And I would like to use this platform also to appeal to everybody that if you patronize frog leg, I think you should please stop doing that. Because this is one way by which you encourage zoonotic spillover or transfer. And in case of the frog and the frog legs, it's not just going to be virus and living pathogens, but it could also be biomagnified pesticides, which could predispose you to a range of malignancies and deformities. So I think this is very important, that no matter how tasty the meat is, all meat should not certainly be patronized unless we are, I think that's very important. While I speak about the need to regulate the trade on wild meat, I need to also say this with a lot of responsibility, that food is a matter of culture, and certain indigenous communities regularly consume wild meat. So in all our policy promulgation, I mean the legal instruments that we debate and promulgate and try to enforce, we need to be aware and conscious that we cannot interfere and bring about acculturation of indigenous communities and deprive them from a subsistence level of wildlife dependence, which is, I think I must explain this, that when somebody goes and kills wildlife for the purpose of trading, that's not subsistence, that's for trade and commerce, because there's a lot of profit, you're making money out of that. And if an indigenous community is sustainably depending on some sort of a wild food resource, because that is the sole source of protein for this impoverished community, then I think you need to think twice before you bring that person and indigenous community in the bracket of your conservation mandate and you know, just shoo them away from the space that they share with wildlife. Because I say this with a lot of care, the most important custodians of our wildlife are these very communities, indigenous communities that share space with wildlife. Let us all accept that much before the Indian Wildlife Protection Act 1972, and much before all the complex science and management evolved to the present status, it is only the traditional ecological knowledge systems and wisdom of our indigenous communities that has saved this wildlife for you and me that we debate about today. If you're talking about the Biological Diversity Act, you're talking about biodiversity celebration, whatever little biodiversity we still hold in our wild spaces, I think we need to kind of acknowledge the fact that it's thanks to the indigenous community who do not look at wildlife as some sort of a trade commodity. It's a part of the environment. It's a part of this, living space, and they relate to these species with a lot of responsibility and a lot of respect. The typical pagan animism or kind of a cult wherein nothing in nature is viewed with arrogance and indifference. That even if you were to kill an animal, you know how many animals you would kill, and you certainly relate to that animal with a sense of guilt, and you seek to be forgiven for that one animal that you killed simply because of your food security is being addressed. So that's fine. So in policy making, we should also understand these anthropological dimensions. I think about 30% of zoonotic diseases have been attributed to human settlements encroaching into wild space. So we need to be very careful. When you aspire to stay very close to the sea, I'm just giving you an example which could have an immediate relevance to everybody who stays in the small maritime state of Goa. We call Amche Goa and Nis Goinkar is very easy to say, but that's just cosmetic if you don't relate to the ground reality and the problems that we face in this tiny little state on the west coast of India, whose total expanse is just about 3,072 square kilometers is all the space that is available, within which you and I and the government has to do a lot of jugglery, a tightrope walk to usher in infrastructure, to improve your living conditions, to give you a hospitality segment, to preserve your wild space is not a joke. It's a tough proposition, and I can most certainly, in many of my expressions, both spoken and written, I have acknowledged that yes, it's not easy. It's very easy for the Greens and for the proponents of wildlife conservation to go critical on the policymakers. I understand, absolutely. But I think unless we raise attention and, kind of weigh these evidences which are going against the whole mandate of wildlife vis-a-vis unsustainable development, somebody has to take a note of that. So this is very important, that in a state like Goa, if every single person who wants to have a small share in Goa, of share in the little land that is left, you want to build a home as close as possible to the sea, because there's nothing like seeing a setting sun or waking up to the lovely noise of the waves crashing on the seashore. But remember, the closer you get to the sea, you are causing an infringement in Goa, at least some stretches of we have a small coastline of 105 linear distance of the sea coast, and in some places in north you probably have Ashwe, Mandre, Morji. In south you've got Talpona, Galjibag, Agonda, which are designated turtle nesting sites. Trust me, maybe until 20 years ago, I have seen turtles being slaughtered mercilessly in our markets. And people have been selling what we typically in Goa call as vanto. Kasoecha masacho vato. It's a small portion of turtle meat. Now that's the whole point. One, you are inviting a zoonotic spillover. You don't know how and from where. You've got a range of animals which can potentially give you all kinds of pathogens. We don't know until one fine day you realize something has come into your body through the turtles. And the turtles live in the sea, and the sea is the ultimate discharge point and the sink of all your anthropogenic wastes. As I say, you flush and forget, but eventually everything ends up in the sea. It is from the same sea that you get the fish that you relish. I have done in my own laboratory a lot of microbial evaluation of the fish quality. We have had episodes in the past where we have had, clam beds reporting a lot of mortality. We have done some screening for a lot of microbes, pathogenic microbes, which of course so far have not kind of manifested into major health issues, but yes. And then the turtle nesting sites have their own requirements. You drive on our seashores in a typical kind of a setting that you get to see in the Bollywood films. And probably you want to walk on the shore and you ride on the shore and drive on the shore, an absolute violation of the fact that here is a turtle nesting site. I mean, that's basically what I call as being insensitive to the need to have inviolate wild spaces. Here the example is about the Olive Ridley turtle site. So yes, 30% of these zoonotic diseases have emerged merely because people have encroached. This is again something very important. Last but not least, of course, pet trade. I've already spoken to you about livestock farming, intensive agriculture, which requires a lot of space, and therefore you slowly start, spreading into these wild pockets. That brings you in close proximity to wildlife. I've already in Goa you have mining, you've got timber extraction, you've got road constructions, you've got residence constructions. All these activities bring human beings in close proximities to wildlife. So, and that's where very importantly the Town and Country Planning Department, or maybe urban planners and people who have stakes in wildlife conservation, the custodians of our wilderness. They have to sit, they have to do a lot of consultations. Unless there is hand-holding between these two critical domains that relate to our state in terms of land use, whether it's wilderness, forest, whether it's settlement zone, industrial zone, there's a thought process, there's a kind of wisdom behind planning and setting apart different areas of Goa for different purpose. You start mixing up, you infringe, you overlap, you intrude, you violate. And ultimate outcome of all this is you bring humans in dangerous proximity to the wildlife and making them very, very susceptible and receptive to. So this is again very important for you to remember that you need stringent laws which will forbid the exploitation of the species for any kind of trade and commercial purpose. And at the end of it, you have this question being asked, why should I be worried about wildlife conservation? Is it only because if I don't conserve wildlife and wild spaces and biodiversity, am I a sure candidate for a pandemic? Well, answer is yes, in a larger sense, because remember, we are connected. What happens in some part of China, in some kind of ravines, there has been a spillover through from a bat into a pangolin to some small local community. Did not take long for it to reach us here. So remember, we are all connected. So don't be oblivious and indifferent to what happens in some part of the world and say, well, this is not anything to do with me. I'm perfectly fine with my life here. I enjoy my, ambience, my greenery, my fish, my sun and sand, and you live in your small little world. Well, there is a larger world beyond Goa with which you have connections. Anything going wrong anywhere in the world is eventually going to come back to you. It's just a matter of time. I think that's an important. So we have to reduce our demand for exotic meats at all costs. We have, without of course interfering, as I've said earlier, with the cultural preference of indigenous communities for wild meat, as long as the exploitative pressures are only at subsistence level, which means not for the purpose of trade and commerce. We have to reduce our demands for exotic meat. I did speak about the damage caused by Latin American restaurants. Asia and Africa, if they decide to move away from wild meat, and of course the traditional Chinese medicine, and if the United States of America decides to very consciously reduce its demand of wildlife for whatever purpose, I think half the battle is won. I say it again. If Asia and Africa chooses to move away from wild meats and the requirements of ingredients for traditional Chinese medicine, and if US stops patronizing that trade, I think half the battle is won. This is a very important, strong statement, but that's very true, and it has, you've got a lot of data pointing towards that. Of course, you should also have a kind of a legal trade tax regime which could be revised to discourage patronage. Even if it's a legal trade in wildlife meat, levy taxes which are very, very high so that people stop patronizing it. It's the same story with cigarettes and alcohol, that you probably can't ban it. And there are, the government recognized retail, distributors and whatever. But the only way to deter people from patronizing something which is, which can cause you dependency physiologically, it's a substance abuse domain. The other way is to alter, revise the tax regime and make it less affordable. I think in wildlife also we can think about this. I think one point I would definitely like to speak today is the need to identify and map global hotspots for this kind of zoonotic spillover, which means we now need to upload this information on a GIS platform and do some sort of intensive and extensive survey of this kind of potential roosting site of bats or some sort of, I'm just giving an example of bat, it could be absolutely any other species, which are known to be a reservoir of pathogens, and identify these portals of transmission or spillover. As I said earlier, interspecific transfers or boundary crossing has to be clearly given some geographic coordinates. If you are able to convert this information on a GIS, Geographic Information System tool, then I think we can pinpoint accurately, and this sort of consolidation or maybe collation of data is going to be very vital, very crucial in planning how to avert and how to minimize the chances of spillover in future. And I'm very happy to share with you that with the support from Goa State Biodiversity Board, the Biodiversity Research Cell is now embarking on a task to do this exercise on a small scale, of course in the state of Goa. Some of my students have been working under my guidance in the Marmagaon Taluka to look at the roosting ecology of few bats, both of which have been implicated in this sort of zoonotic spillover, but that's a very pilot scale study, but nonetheless we have started doing that, and hopefully with the support of Goa State Biodiversity Board we plan to scale it up. So this will probably address a critical gap in our understanding of where exactly in Goa do we have bat roost sites, what is the nearest human settlement to that, and what are the conduits. If ever there is some sort of a spillover, either through feces or through, I don't know, meats and blood, and you have a lot of communities in Goa as well, which I know of personally, that patronize and they prefer wild meats over the conventional traded meats. So I think that's one segment that would really have to be considered. We are also doing a study on attitudes and perceptions of people and local community towards the bats. We are also seeking to involve through the ages of Goa State Biodiversity Board, the biodiversity management committees of villages in whose jurisdiction there have been reports of caves and bat roosting sites. So a lot is in the offing, a little bit has happened thus far, but sustained efforts on part of the local community, on part of the policy makers, on part of the statutory agencies like the Goa State Biodiversity Board, and of course not to forget, hand-holding with academia and research is the answer to understanding this, or rather addressing these gaps in critical information. So I think that's again something I thought I would speak to you about this. Last but not the least, I would just like to share my views on the need to prize biodiversity, and that's just a thought I think I should be sharing on this important occasion of International Day for Biological Diversity, and which is all about coming up with a sort of a regime in which you give economic compensation to local communities, or maybe even governments, or maybe to countries that proactively engage in habitat restoration or protection. This is exactly on the lines of carbon credits. How you earn carbon credits by stepping up ways of carbon sequestration, either through increasing the forest cover, or maybe by altering your behavior to kind of depend less on fossil fuels and anything that would emit greenhouse gases and so on and so forth. Exactly on the same lines, if we have a policy whereby for every acreage of land that you protect and that probably you are able to restore back to its pristine habitat matrices, you earn certain waivers, either on tax regimes or debts that you owe to some country, including the International Monetary Funds, IMF, I'm talking about IMF, or maybe the World Bank, or if some you have an international loan that you're finding difficult to repay, maybe the international stakeholder community, as far as biodiversity is concerned, could sit together and look at the possibility of pricing biodiversity and allowing you to redeem that in view of your restoration efforts or your protection efforts. That's just a thought, and I think that's probably going to, this kind of debt waivers in recognition of your effort towards conserving biodiversity and wild spaces with a larger view of minimizing and clearly spacing out the wild from the human to discourage a spillover is definitely, in my opinion, a very interesting and out-of-box way of looking at things. Well, in conclusion, I think I've taken quite a long time to explain the nuances and the finer points of the whole issue. The theme of today's talk, as was given to me, was zoonosis and biodiversity, the conservation implications. There's a very clear connect between zoonosis, emergence, resurgence, the current pandemic, and its connect with biodiversity conservation. For a long time, people thought areas which are very biodiverse are hotspots of zoonotic reservoir. Today we realize you need to have such areas, and you need to delimit your human settlement to maintain that respectful distance from this kind of hotspots? I think the answer is somewhere in the between the two. We need more research, of course, and we can't be sermonizing in absence of scientific data. But I'm very optimistic, and I'm very hopeful that with a very proactive government, with very young ministers who understand the complexities of science, and an amazingly proactive and energetic group like the Goa State Biodiversity Board under the leadership of Dr. Pradeep Sarmokadam. The day is not very far when we would have really a very user-friendly, collated database on these critical aspects that will help us understand our biodiversity better and probably take the requisite steps to protect it and conserve it for posterity. With these few words, I just would like to conclude that if you want to avert any further zoonotic spillovers, as also halt resurgence and emergence of new pathogenic organisms which are reservoired in the wildlife, I think you need to review and revise our interactions with our nature. That's very important. I mean, we need to review from a fresh prism of this connection, right, between zoonosis and biodiversity. Thank you so much for your patient hearing, and it was a pleasure to connect with you. If you have any queries, and if time permits, of course, I will be online to take your queries. Thank you. Have a pleasant day, and let us all resolve to unitedly forge this mandate and take it further. Let Goa be teeming, whilst it ushers in infrastructure development. We should also be very proud of our green spaces, and we should be on the forefront of national scape in proudly showing the whole world, well, this is what we have and this is what we preserve for posterity. God bless you. Have a lovely day. God bless. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Manoj Borkar, for such an informative lecture. There are some questions. I think Simran will read them out, and you can address them, please.
I think, am I audible? Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Even
Yes,
before
sir.
I start responding to queries from the learned audience, I would like to take, with your permission, the opportunity to recognize the presence of some stalwarts of biodiversity. Dr. Ravi Shankar Tupali, who's been a consultant of international repute, having given his consultancy to United Nations and FAO. We have Professor Satyanarayana, who is a stalwart again in the domain of wildlife biology. He's been a professor of wildlife. Of course, Dr. Baba Ningole has been always very kind and encouraging. And my colleague, Dr. Utkarsha Mantri Chavan, who's also now on board of a subcommittee with the forest biodiversity and other vulnerable ecosystems. I'm sorry if I missed out on anybody, but thank you so much for gracing this occasion. You made me feel happy. God bless. Yes, please.
So we have a few questions for you.
I'm not able to hear you. I'm not able to hear you.
Am I audible?
Yes, now you are. Now you are. Simran, please.
Yes. So the first question is from Mr. Sanjeet Kumar Saha regarding anthropological dimensions, how we can assure check and balance if the wildlife traders use the people from tribal communities for poaching. Sir, you're not audible. Dr. Manoj, sir, are you there?
Till Dr. Manoj Borkar sir reconnects with us, I request Dr. Baba Ningole to please take over and comment on sir's lecture, please. Sir, kindly unmute yourself, please. Dr. Baban Ingole, sir. Please unmute yourself. Please the co-host. I can't unmute him.
Yes, now I think I'm audible. Yes, right. May I respond to Sahaji? Am I audible? Am I audible, please?
Yes, sir, you're
Yes.
audible.
Right. So I'm so sorry for the time lost, but yes, Sahaji, I completely agree with you that a lot of local communities have been certainly engaged by the poachers and by the illicit wildlife traders. And I completely agree with you that outsiders cannot invade unless there is cooperation from insiders. I think that's a thumb rule. So I think this issue could be resolved by trying to engage in a dialogue with the local community and attempting to convince them through better options or incentives, and maybe I would say rehabilitating them in the sense of offering them alternative occupations which may not be at par in terms of economic benefits, but most certainly they need to be told that they are stakeholders and custodians of the local community. I hope that answers your question.
Yes. Yes. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, the question, please.
There is one more question from teacher Chandralekha Mistry.
Yes,
How do we stop the destruction?
I'm so sorry. Could you please repeat that?
It's a question from teacher Chandralekha Mistry.
Right.
How do we stop the destruction of huge endemic in bracket 1 every year under the name of rituals and religious beliefs?
Well, I think that's again got to do with anthropology and the cultural connect with biodiversity. I think the best way is to engage these communities, demystify the complexities and all the jargon of conservation biology and speak to them in a language that they best understand. And very importantly, give them a participatory role in conservation. I think in a country like India, where the bedrock of our culture has been respect towards nature, it's not very difficult to convince people on the need to conserve and, maybe again, review their own cultural connect with the larger biodiversity. It's not going to be happening overnight, but yes, I can quickly respond. In Goa, we have this Gaon Bhoni practice where annually everybody gets into the forest and attempts to flush out animals by beating their drums. And then maybe good old days, they would hunt a lot of these animals in the name of the deity, but now it's very ritualistic. And maybe just one animal for namesake. But these are parts of our culture. As long as it does not interfere with the renewal dynamics, I think it's perfectly fine. The minute you start sensing that this sort of rituals and the cultural, moorings have started destroying a biodiversity, then one would have to look at it with more caution. I think I have attempted to answer Chandralekha, who happens to be my student and now a very popular teacher of biology. Thank you, Chandra.
Thank you, sir. Before we take up a question by Baban Ingole sir himself, there is one question from Jnaneshwar. It asks, what are the concrete steps we can take as a first generation farmer about maintaining a fine balance between nature and farming? Would you like to take it up, sir?
Yes, this is not my domain expertise, or I must confess, I don't really know much about farming practices and how congruent are they with biodiversity conservation. But I can say one thing with some conviction, that we need to maintain indigenous cultivars and not go for a kind of intensive monocultures of the so-called hybrids, which are commercially more beneficial and they sell in the market. So I think that gene pool of indigenous crop varieties must be maintained at all costs, and intensive farming practices would have to be practiced with some sort of caution. That's all that I would like to say. And I think I have a question from a very senior scientist, Dr. Baban Ingole. Can you elaborate on white coat
Yes.
biology? Yes, well, this is a term that may prima facie sound very derogatory, but this is how we distinguish between science that we practice, of biology that we practice in our labs. And the prefix of white coat is to indicate the fancy for the apron and the patty plates and the sophisticated paraphernalia, and a very little connect with the outdoors and the field. I hope that answers your question, Dr. Pavan. But I do completely understand that we need to handhold with the white coat biologist. I completely agree with you. Thank you.
Dr. Ravishankar Tupalli wants to speak something.
I would not muster courage to answer his questions, but I would most certainly welcome his advice to all of us here. Yes, sir, please. Dr. Tupalli, I think you have to unmute yourself.
Yes, good afternoon, Manoj, and
good afternoon, sir.
Ingol also is there, and as usual, your talk is always inspiring. That is why I always listen to you. And as far as International Day of Biological Diversity is concerned, it is 3 decades since we had the Convention on Biodiversity, where along with the other 2 that is conventions like what is that, climate change and desertification and biodiversity. And it is 2 decades since we ourselves had our biological diversity. So now what are we have also the strategy and national strategy, what we call in India as National Biodiversity Action Plan, strategy and action plan. And all the states also have. Right now, I am sitting in Shillong, working with government of Meghalaya, and they have very good Meghalaya State Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan. And also, under the Biological Diversity Act, implementation responsibility is with the NBA and of course with state biodiversity boards. And still NBA is holding the responsibility of implementing the act in union territories, where we need to have some councils or something like that. But still, the challenge is in the Northeast is they don't have panchayats. Am I audible?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So when there are no panchayats, there are only tribal councils. How the biodiversity management committees can be constituted, and how these biodiversity management committees can draw the PBRs. And because the mandatory PBRs have now not been developed, NGT also has penalized, and every month some states are paying 10 lakh rupees or something like that. Under this situation, what I have already been advocating or suggesting both the NBA and state biodiversity boards is that in order to also implement the Nagoya Protocol, the ABS mechanism very efficiently, the NBA and state biodiversity board should select very good biodiversity areas where within the jurisdiction of biodiversity management committees, there will be tradable bioresources. Because, unless there is some trade that can come, what is the use of having a qualitative people's biodiversity register? Simply saying this many species, this many species are there, like plants, animals, birds. But what is the yield of a soap net in that particular area? For example, in Goa, in one biodiversity management committee jurisdiction, if they can get 1,000 quintals of soap net in a year, in a season, they can have some kind of a negotiation with at least the local trader, and they can get some money out of that, and they can put that money in local biodiversity fund, half of which can be used for enhancing or enriching the biodiversity in that area, and the rest of that can be used for developmental activities. You see, without any developmental activities or some benefit that is coming to the community, nobody will be interested in saving the biodiversity or preserving the biodiversity. So under these circumstances, the template of biodiversity, people's biodiversity register should be more towards quantitative rather than qualitative. Otherwise, it is very difficult for local communities because already there are so many things the local communities are worried about. So they don't have time to kind of involve themselves in biodiversity conservation unless some benefit is coming to them. Like, if they go and collect MFP or NTFP, they get some kind of, money or the benefit from that. So this is where now we have to look at and then choose the biodiversity management, constitute biodiversity management committees in areas where we will get good amount of quantity of tradable bioresource. We have to identify that. Otherwise, having if the mechanism is really good, that we have, some committees are there at district level, technical guidance committees, which are guiding them, and they have all the wherewithal to do that. And biodiversity boards are supporting, and NBA is also supporting. And but they are also getting penalized. That is the issue. So they are not getting anything out of ABS except for red sanders, where they have a lot of money, and that goes only for Andhra Pradesh Biodiversity Board from National Biodiversity Authority. But what about other state biodiversity boards? Because biodiversity conservation means budget allocation is very less. All the corporate social responsibility things go for somewhere else, not for biodiversity. As Borkan wonderfully said, the need is there. What is, awareness? Mostly awareness is lacking, and only very few hands, working at local level and also spending their whole lifetime will not suffice. This is a good mechanism that we have the Biodiversity Act, and also we have National Biodiversity Authority. But strategies and action plans should be at field level. It cannot end up like paper tigers. So they should be kind of, implementable plans where when implemented, the local community will get benefit. Then only local community will be interested. We can't expect more than this. Just these few words I wanted to share. Thank you.
Thank you. Very valuable advice. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Ravi Shankar, sir.
I think Professor Satyanarayana, Madam, Professor Satyanarayana wants to say something.
Yeah. Good afternoon, Broker. Excellent. You see, it is actually not only awareness, it's actually sensitizing about the pandemics or the zoonotic diseases. But it is very, very, very unfortunate in our country that though we talk about a lot of pandemic and we have spent millions of rupees, in terms of rupees, all those for your pandemic diseases, but unfortunately we have not taken up much of the data with regard to the how these zoonotic disease spreads from the wild to the animal. Maybe these things we are not taken up. See the data. What is the data? Where you have the baseline data for this to prove that the bats are responsible for this pandemic, or maybe some other animals are there. And unfortunately, I think we are lacking in the generation of the data. Though the forest department are not worried about this pandemic, because they say that it is not concerned about this. It is a healthcare department. Maybe the ICM, Indian Institute of Medical Research, is responsible for doing some research on these pandemics. So that's the one observation I require. Moreover, we do not have most of the veterinary field biologists. We do not much of the microbiologists. We do not have a very good microbiologist, except the Indian Research Institute, Pune, and also there is the North India Veterinary Research Institute. And these are things we have to think about. We could not wait for that. One important negative aspect is that when people are talking about the bats are responsible for this, I know even the urban, like Chennai city, we have the urban excellent bat diversity in the heart of the city. But people are thought, why should I have bats? When you say pandemic, we want to kill all bats. We don't want to go to the area. See, somebody I seen in the chat box also, how to remove the huge trees, because the bat comes and roosts there. They want to cut all the trees. And also one more information I want to share is that I heard that people are not consuming the fruits also, because they know that the fruit bats, they come and eat that, and so we don't want to eat fruits also. And then what I rightly said, that we don't have much awareness programs. So during that, how actually wildlife plays a role, and these awareness programs are very, very essential if you want to conserve them. And lastly, that one more thing, that's sensitive that regarding the tribal population. So we must have a tribal. At the same time, I want to tell you that what we have tribal now is not the traditional tribal. See, we have manipulated, actually we have contaminated the culture in the name of the hill area development or the tribal development. All these things we talk on the other side. We want to keep the tribal culture, and how two things is not imbalanced. And that is, and not only that, the outsiders, the public or the people, actually they go and they sensitize them, they change their attitude, and in terms of the money. So we pay this much of amount, you do like that, you do the illegal trade. That is the one reason why the policy makers want to translocate or relocate or the settlements. These are the various problems faced by the forest managers. If we keep them, there are other problems they're facing that. So these are what my observation that I think, so there are so many interconnecting things. One has to be very, very careful about that. And what I request is now, all the forest department, immediately we have the ad hoc projects involving the researchers, all those things, to generate the data with regard to, not only about your whatever the COVID, but what about your KFD, Castor Forest Disease? There are a number of zoonotic diseases are there, and we don't have the database. Unfortunately, we do not have a database system, and also we do not have your surveillance and monitoring. That is, we have the surveillance monitoring committee in the forest management. This is a comfort thing. When you talk about conservation, priority should be. But unfortunately, regarding the surveillance or whatever it may be regarding the healthcare system or the veterinary care, we are lacking that. So we have to come forward to projects, many more proposals in the forest department, maybe management program to have a very. Thank you very much once again for all the organizers for having given opportunity. And I say, I'm sorry, I am a retired Professor Satyanarayana from the Department of Wildlife and Zoology, AVC College, Mailadurai, Tamil Nadu. And actually, I was teaching the parasitology and healthcare for my MSc Wildlife Biology. And it's very, 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 I think what we are doing is very, very less. We do not have the veterinary care. We are not giving the priorities much care about the. We talk about we celebrate today the International Biodiversity. We talk so much biodiversity, but this is what we require immediately. I think the forest official or our administrator will take care of the protect wildlife or the biodiversity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Excellent presentation.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, I had actually put that in chat box, but if Manoj sir is there in front of us, I would like to wish him a very happy birthday. Today is his birthday. So a very happy birthday.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Utkarsh. Thank you. In fact, as we discussed this, there is a new alert being sounded by the government of India to mount surveillance at all critical international points, ports and airports. It's about the monkeypox virus. Cases are already being reported from United States, Spain, and many other parts of the world. And I don't think it's not going to be taking a long time before we would have cases of monkeypox being reported from India as well. So we really need to be extremely careful and vigilant and alert on all these zoonotic spillovers. Right. Thank you. I'm done.
Sir, I would like to ask one question. It is not related to Goa or Goa biodiversity at all, but at Mahad, where I am working on crocodile behavior, there are some islands in the river, and those are being removed on the pretext that those islands are being nuisance for the flow of river Savitri. So to what extent removal of those islands will be good? Because as far as I know, those islands have been there for nearly about more than 100,000 years. Because what I should say, the archaeology
Dr.
department.
Dr. Utkarsha, I think your question is well taken, and nobody better than Dr. Pavan Ingole, who has been on quite a few statutory boards and authorities of government of Maharashtra who should be able to answer this. If it's a CRZ area, I think he would be the best person to respond to your query. Baban sir.
So please unmute yourself. We cannot hear you. Dr. Baban.
He probably has some issue with his machine.
Dr. Ingoli, sir,
Dr.
please
Ingole,
unmute
sir,
yourself.
please unmute. You're not unmuting since beginning. No, you're not being
Can the
heard.
host unmute? Yeah.
Okay.
Sir, we cannot hear you. Baban sir, we cannot hear you.
Sir, please leave and join again. Otherwise, we'll try that time. Dr. Baban Ingole, sir, can you hear us? Please leave. Let's try.
But to respond to this query in the interim time, I understand from a very general perspective, if it's a CRZ area, Dr. Utkarsha, it's not very easy to do away with those islands. I think they very much come in the ambit of the coastal regulatory zone. Is this river under a tidal influence?
Yes, it is.
Are these mangroves?
Yes, there are mangroves.
Then I think it's not going to be that easy unless there are strong
But they have
political
already
pressures.
started and they have removed 2 islands and they have
No, that is exactly
started,
what I said.
they have plans to remove the island wherein the muggers are breeding.
That is exactly what I said. This invites the provisions of Indian Wildlife Protection Act
In fact,
1972.
there is a newspaper, what I should say. In newspaper, it has come that the muggers have gone away from River Savitri. It's not the case. They are there. They are. It's now their breeding season, so they will be there on that island now. But they are not seen everywhere nowadays. So there is one, what I should say, a write-up in a newspaper that muggers have left River Savitri today. I was actually being continuously called by Mahad people and I couldn't pick up the phone. Then they just sent me that that please ask this question so that they can put up.
So as I said, and let me repeat, whether these come under coastal regulatory zone implications or not, I think they're simply covered under Indian Wildlife Protection Act 1972, which forbids anyone from disturbing, destroying, or altering or fragmenting a habitat of a Schedule 1 species. Please remember, Crocodylus palustris, which is what you say is mugger, is a Schedule 1 species. Therefore, any kind of infringement on the habitat or any kind of attempt to disturb that, particularly at the breeding site, tantamounts to violation of the act. I think you will have to look in that direction. Thank you.
Okay, fine. Okay, fine. Thank you.
Right, ma'am. I think Dr. Baban is back. He would probably have. Sir, again, we are not able to hear you.
So please try removing the headphone. I think that is creating some problem. We still cannot hear you, sir.
Please remove the headphone from the unit and just use the whatever laptop or mobile.
No.
Please contact him or phone and then mobile and then tell him.
No, he's still muted. Actually, he's still muted. He's unable to unmute himself. He's still muted. I think, Reshma ma'am, you could probably take the next question. In the meanwhile, he will try to join. If not, we close this session and proceed further.
We have some suggestions from Dr. Niseta. She is our suggestions. Just the upper one. Yeah. Upper. Yeah. This from here. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not very sure how you say her name, but
it's Dr. Niseta. She has.
Dr. Niseta, yes.
She said first, try not to have a monoculture in farming. And then later on, she has given some more suggestions. In intensive farming practice, usually monoculture is followed, and this is a source of vulnerability to pests and diseases. also leads to leaching of soil minerals over time. And then permaculture is a fancy name given to what our ancestors used to follow. Also, we had a rotational crop like paddy as per the soil or field conditions. So we should go for cowpea. There's a typo, or on the edges we can put in ragi. Same with spread of diseases in areas of.
She says crowing, but I'm not very sure what she means by that.
Some. Yeah.
But in any case, my response to her suggestion would be, this is exactly what we call as traditional ecological knowledge systems of our communities. You may come up with, a big list of fancy names like permaculture is one, and you've talked about homogenized ecosystems and monoculture. Our ancestors very well knew the benefits of rotating crops to, reinstate the soil fertility and what have you. So absolutely right. And I think, therefore, traditional ecological knowledge systems is a very important and vital component of the PBR process. And I think the State Biodiversity Board has been doing that pretty well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. We are still trying to get in touch with Baban, sir. We have asked him to join from mobile.
I suppose the next session is to be conducted by Dr. Baban, right?
We'll wait for a few minutes for Baban Ingole sir to join us. He is an expert member of Goa State Biodiversity Board, the present reconstituted board. Able to join?
May I take your leave because I need to go somewhere else? Is it okay if I leave?
Yes. Yes, ma'am. Yes, you're excused. Thank you so much for your support and joining this day. Thank you, ma'am.
Thanks a lot. Thank you. Thank you.
The recording has stopped.
Hello. Am I audible, Dr. Manoj?
Yes, very much.
Sir, yes. Yes, sir. Now you're audible.
Yeah, I have joined it from my mobile.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Now it's good to hear you. Yes, very clear.
I'm very sorry. From laptop, there was some problem.
Absolutely.
This meeting is being recorded.
Can I respond to the question? Utkarsha had it about.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Actually, whatever has been done, I am sure it has been, without the much studies. Those islands are part of the ecosystem and they are contributing to the ecology. Absolutely. And therefore, they should not be, removed it by, unless scientifically it has been shown that they are, obstacle for some system. I don't think, except the navigation, there will be any other problem.
Right, sir.
But there are vested interests in that area. I know it about, some of those. I was there, as Dr. Manoj rightly mentioned, about CRZ and some other committees. We visited some of those areas. There was some mining going on. both illegal and illegal. In bracket, I am just putting illegal because I'm not sure, but definitely. And therefore, those people have their vested interest. Mining is one of the area which is illegally or legally being done in that area. But they want to take their barges, and because of the island, they will not get the appropriate depth. So this is in the pretext of navigation or some other thing. They also can make use of the resources, like sand mining is another thing which they make use of it. I am not particularly aware of this one or two island, but definitely not in the interest of the biology or the ecology of the. Is it okay? Hello. Hello.
Yes, sir, we can hear you. We can hear you, sir.
We can hear you.
I have completed my response.
I think, Reshma, probably I read one question from Shailaja Sharif.
Yes.
Is there a connection between climate change? Oh, very much, yes. Absolutely, yes. And let me put it this way. With climate change, you've got a lot of changes in phenology and the associated fauna. So, I mean, yes, in a big way, climate change is one of the drivers of zoonotic spillovers and spreads.
I now call upon Dr. Babban Ningole, sir, to give the official formal vote of thanks. He is expert member GSBB. Please join us, sir.
Yes. Am I audible?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah. At the outset, I certainly would like to, compliment Dr. Manoj Borkar. First, I wish on behalf of the Biodiversity Board a very happy birthday, Dr. Manoj.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it was a very nice program, organized program, and I'm sure very informative program. Today, Biodiversity Board, Goa State Biodiversity Board have organized it, and I would like to, specifically thanks the chief guest, Honorable Minister Shri Nilesh Kabralji, for giving an overview of State Biodiversity Board's activities, how different activities in last couple of years Goa State Biodiversity is being undertaking, specifically with the different panchayat. And there are some of the areas, new areas like mud bank and wetland areas conservation. As well as promoting the state level and panchayat level BMCs for undertaking the biodiversity inventories, and also identifying some of the very important species in each village level, so that its conservation and as Dr. Ravi Shankar Tripali has rightly mentioned out, what benefits can the villagers get from that. So if they can identify fruits, vegetables, or any economically important species of the particular village, State Biodiversity Board will take initiative to promote that one on the commercial scale, so that at the panchayat level, some benefits can be drawn from the local commodities. I also would like to thank the Secretary Shri Arun Kumar Mishra ji for putting up a very nice proposition about the importance of biodiversity and today's day, both connect with the human being and the biodiversity. I also would like to thank Dr. Pradeep Sir Mukadam for initiating and organizing such a wonderful and his opening address. I specifically would like to thank two of the persons. One is Dr. Mahendra Bale from the Ambauli, for giving his elaborate experience about the PBR formation, how documentation, and how the each individual from their panchayat have been contributing for the preparing the biodiversity, and also the process of validation of the biodiversity, and to encourage other villages to come forward. Also, another person is, I would like to thank Mr. Joseph De Silva from the Pomburupa. He also mentioned it very nicely about his process of biodiversity, PBR formation, and involvement of the individual members from the panchayat level. So these are some of the people who attended, and there are many people who virtually attended the programs. I would like to thanks all of them for attending and encouraging the activities. Finally, I specifically want to thank Dr. Manoj Borkar for his elaborated, very nice, illustrated talk. In fact, personally, I have been benefited a lot. We are very good friends, and I know Dr. Manoj for decades. But today I have learned a different facet of Dr. Manoj, and his experience, and also how nicely he has put up about few of the issues. One example I can give you about the definition of habitat, so that the individual people at the grassroots level can understand. I mentioned it in the question, about white coat biology. The new terminology, very nicely put up. How important is the field biology? That is what I'm sure he wanted to make sure the put the field biology. And when you talk about wildlife conservation, unless you go to the field, nothing can be learn it. And if you can't learn it, what more you can implement it? So therefore, the terminology with respect, I don't want to defame or something like that, but both are important. What is important is, when you talk about conservation, it is important to learn what is there in the nature, and therefore the field biology or wildlife biology is very important in the context of the conservation. Thank you, Dr. Manoj Borkar, once again. And finally, Reshma, both the Reshma and Simran, all the people involved in organizing this program, on the behalf of the State Biodiversity Board, I would like to thank everyone for making successfully organizing this program. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ingole. Before we wind up and end today's program, I would like to say, see you all on 5th of June, the coming June, at NIO Auditorium for the physical celebration of the IDB 2022 and the presentation of the Goa State Conservation Awards for the year 2022. Thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you everyone for joining and for such an informative and interactive session.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Bye-bye. Have a pleasant day. God bless.
Thank you, sir.